So, unless you've been living under a rock recently, you probably noticed GW releasing the Adeptus Custodes codex and full army to 40k. The new models are pretty rad, and their codex isn't half bad either. It's got some pretty intriguing lore that touches upon a delightfully diverse range of fluff, from the Black Library minutiae to old Fantasy Flight obscurity. But naturally, the army list is a bit limited, there being only 5 dedicated model kits for the Emperor's Guardians. Though the kits and rules have been well designed to squeeze the extra datasheets from those boxes with Vexillas and Shield Captains, and they still have the horrendously out of place Land Raider and Contemptor Dreadnoughts filling out the book, it still pales in comparison to longer standing armies. Now, there is the consideration that this can all be alleviated with some Imperial soup, 8th edition making such allied forces very easy, and this type of list was clearly in mind going by certain rules, but wouldn't it be nice if there were some more options that could really make the army feel a little more fleshed out and suitable for being run without a slew of Imperial allies? Wouldn't it be convenient if there were, say, 10 or so more model kits just waiting in the wings that could be added to the army list? Well, if there were such miniatures, all they'd need is some rules compatible with 8th edition and they'd sell like hotcakes. Now, of course, Forge World has been getting pestered about this constantly since the Adeptus Custodes codex got announced. The response has been a little hazy, the first word being that some of the models will get rules soon, and later that the 30k Legio would have to wait for an Imperial Armour type publication until they saw the 41st millennium. Now, if that is the case, then that means they'll have to wait at least until Fires of Cyraxus is out of the way, but we'll get to that can of phosphex later. Regardless, putting that much of a wait time on releasing rules seems like bad business sense. After all, the hype for Custodes is at a peak it won't likely ever top. Beyond that, it's not like the Custodes were absent from 40k all of this time. They got introduced back in 7th ed with the Burning of Prospero box that kicked off the modern Custodian releases in general. They even shared a codex with the Sisters of Silence for all of the few minutes before 8th edition kicked it asunder. If Forge World had released rules for the Legio Custodes models during that time, then the Adeptus Custodes would have been a fully fledged army long before GW ever got this codex out the door. So why didn't they? After all, they had the models, the hard part was out of the way, all they needed was to write the rules. Hell, for most of that time, 40k was still in 7th edition, so they wouldn't have even had to bother changing the rules that much from how they appeared in the Inferno book. But before we get any further on this, let's shift back to Fires of Cyraxus. Now, if you're not up to date, this book is primarily meant to bring the 30k Mechanicum units into the 40k AdMech army list, with some Tau and Red Scorpions content on the side. Moreover, this book has been in limbo for a very long time. At this point, it's been about 2 years. Yeah. Consider that the 40k AdMech was released in 2015, and Forge World already had a stock of 30k Martian miniatures that could match GW's even then. And since 2015, the AdMech army list has been languishing with a pretty small volume of options, especially with mind to their size in the lore, as compared to factions that are intrinsically more limited, like, say, the Gene Stealer cults. The exceptions to this rule were the Ordinati Minoris and the Secutari units that Forge World produced, yet with the switch to 8th edition and despite the promises of Forge World, these units were conspicuous by their absence from the index books. As of the time of writing, the current rumour is that Fires of Cyraxus will be out soon, at some point after the Tau Codex drops. At this point, any Tau rules it includes would be redundant unless they were without corresponding miniatures, since they've all been present in an index, and similar could be said of the Marines, the Carab not even having rules out already. If word is to be believed, then the 30k Custodes will be getting 40k rules at some point after that. Now, to be fair, Forge World does have some very good excuses, especially for the last 18 months. There's the whole 8th edition thing, which forced them to remake rules for almost all of their 40k compatible units. There's also the revival of specialist games, which have apparently required the drafting of a significant chunk of the relevant Forge World staff. And finally, there's the tragic loss of the late great Alan Bligh, who, so they say, was basically the one keeping the whole show running. But on the other hand, look at things from a business sense. On a simple level of supply and demand, the releasing of 40k rules for things like the Legio Custodes models would directly and immediately increase the demand for them, since they would now be playable in another game system, not to mention a much more widely played game system, especially now, since 30k's lingering in 7th Ed has caused a not insignificant dip in its popularity. Surely it's just simple economic sense to release 40k rules with pretty much every non-character 30k miniature that doesn't fit a pre-existing datasheet. As far as I can see, there are 3 possible counter-arguments for this. One is that holding off on such rules means they can be released exclusively in a book, a large and very expensive book. Now, I can't comment on how the profits of books like Imperial Armor compare to theoretical lost sales, but I will comment that the content of books are much easier to acquire for free than physical products. Even when Forge World's digital releases were limited, I can tell you that scans of rules didn't take long to appear on 4chan. Next argument is a hope that keeping models gated to 30k will force interested players to dive in fully, thus meaning more profits as they are pushed into buying a full army of Forge World resin rather than a few units. Again, hard to comment on the validity of this strategy without accurate sales figures and statistics, but one would imagine that there are more people willing to dip their toes into something like 30k Mechanicum units than there are people willing to buy full armies of them. Hell, wasn't that the idea behind the ally system? Tricking people into buying a small force of other armies to add to their main one with a guarantee of more sales than would have been, and then a chance of a few people getting hooked after that and building those allied forces out into full armies later on? And the final argument is a preservation of the lore. Now, this one only applies in some cases. For instance, Phalanx are said to still be used by the Auto Reductor in the 41st millennium. Volkite weapons, on the other hand, are said to be almost impossible to reproduce. Now, on one hand, I can respect this mindset. 40k is meant to be all about collapse into a dark age of ignorance, and there are few ways to better illustrate that than having technologies once available simply lost to time and totally inaccessible to 40k armies. That kind of reflection of fluff in rules adds a level of almost verisimilitude. On the other hand, Volkite is really cool. I mean, GW already broke the embargo with the Tech Priest Dominus and again with the Tartaros Terminator Sergeant. Also, Forge World broke the embargo themselves by porting the Knight Styrax in an index, and it deserves reiteration that Volkite is really, really cool. But seriously, there are ways to illustrate the rarity of such artifacts while still letting them be taken. Their ruling for relic units and 40k marine lists is the most obvious example, though they did it better in prior editions when it made fluffy use of tech marines. Point is, there are solutions that satisfy both perspectives. Forge World has done the hard and expensive part. They got models sculpted and in production, but they seem to struggle so much with the easy part of writing rules for them that are applicable to a wider audience. The Adeptus Custodes army list could be over twice its current size already if Forge World were more on the ball, but instead they're waiting for an unknown time at which rules turn these models to anything above display pieces for the majority of interested players. The same could be said for the AdMech, but on a timescale of years. And this isn't to mention the factor of doubt. They might decide that certain units shouldn't be allowed in 40k since they have, say, too much Volkite, meaning that folks are going to be hesitant to buy anything for fear that it'll be left out when rules do eventually come. So, here's how I, an utterly unqualified and brain problem-addled weirdo on the internet, think they should be doing things. Remember how Forge World used to release one-page PDFs with experimental rules for a bunch of models that didn't have books for the relevant datasheets? Well, I think they should bring those back and start doing them for basically everything, with the obvious exception of characters. Make it clear that the rules are not necessarily that well playtested, but at least release rules. It wouldn't be that hard, just put stats into a template. Hell, I could do it for the whole 30k Custodes models in no more than a few days. Just eyeball the 7th Ed stats, compare with the point costs in the 40k index, and convert on the fly. You could even use the community site to release the files, and you wouldn't even have to worry about updating the pages on the Forge World website. Once you've done that, then keep an eye on the conversations, use tourneys as testing grounds, update the PDFs if there are any massive issues, and once you've got a read of things, then compile sets of updated, cleaned up and polished rule sets in the big expensive Imperial armor books. Just add lore until you feel like you've justified the price tag. Hell, once you've got the big sets out of the way, why not start looking into some of the more specific Legion stuff? Wouldn't it be rad if, say, Iron Hands and successors using their chapter tactic could take Gorgon Terminators with unique rules, or Thousand Suns could take Psychic Contemptors and Battle Automata? That could add so much variety to Marine armies. It wouldn't even mess with the lore. After all, it's meant to be closer to midnight than ever before. That's why GW has been carting out Primarchs. What better excuse for chapters and other forces to start raiding armories, vaults, and proverbial piggy banks for all of the irreplaceable ancient toys? Essentially what I'm saying is that GW should hire me to make slapdash rules for every non-character model in the 30k range. I accept payment in the form of tins of beans, canned soup, fruit pastels, and links to my YouTube channel. Actually, any food will do. Please help. But seriously, this sentiment of desire for Forge World products, if only they had 40k rules, has been circulating for years. As I've reiterated time and time again, the hard part, making the models to begin with, is already done. Forge World only needs to bodge together some datasheets and everyone gets what they want. The fans get more versatility from their toys and a reason to buy the resin dolls. G-Dubs gets more money. Win-win. And if they hire me to do it, then I might not end up homeless. Win-win-win.